y madres. Eh, Claire es una líder muy experiente en muchas áreas. Es, además de su experiencia en el sector tanto público como regulador y corporativo, ella es una ponente inspiracional principalmente. Y estoy segura que lo que ella tiene que decir va a resonar con nosotros y va a hacernos pensar sobre cómo estamos viviendo estos tiempos tan diferentes y cómo todo esto está impactando a nuestros hijos e hijas. Claire, eh, es una honor tenerla aquí con ustedes y usted tiene la palabra. Gracias, Lucia. Antes que se vaya, tiene que hablar de los diferentes canales, ¿no? Sí, en otro idioma, porque
Están aquí hoy y comprenden español y no comprenden inglés y están en una computadora de escritorio, entonces si buscan el icono que está debajo, que
look
es
for
If
the
you're using a
icon that's at the
computer,
bottom
there
of
will
the
be a
screen.
globe in the
You click
bar
on that,
below
and
where
then you
you
can
can select
access
the
the Spanish
language.
channel to listen to the
And
simultaneous interpretation. And, and those that have a mobile, you have
for
to
those
click
who
on
are
the
using a
three
mobile
dots on
device,
the bottom of the screen, and
it's a
then you
little
will have a
trickier. You
drop-down
have to find
menu.
those
Then you
three
will have
dots
the
where it
possibility to
says
choose
more, and there
the
you will be able to
language icon
select
and then
the
choose
language.
Spanish.
Good morning, everyone. For those who are in a desktop or computer, you'll find that globe right next to the raise hand icon, and then you can select the language. If you are using a tablet or perhaps a cell phone, you have to look for those three dots, and there you will find the option.
Thank you. So in this session, we're going to be talking about psychological safety.
Nessa sessão, vamos falar sobre segurança psicológica e por que crianças podem estar tentando uma coisa ou outra, por que e como podem estar se sentindo. E tenho certeza que vai servir para vocês também. E lembre-se, fiquem à vontade de fazer perguntas ao final, todas as perguntas são bem-vindas. Vamos falar sobre o que é a segurança psicológica, vamos falar sobre como identificar, porque não é o caso de se perguntar, você se sente seguro psicologicamente? Vamos também falar sobre como construir a confiança e segurança, e vamos também falar em tempos tão difíceis como o de hoje, como buscar essa construção. A professora Edmondson, que é uma grande guru nesse assunto, diz que é difícil definir em uma sentença o que é a segurança psicológica, mas o que é essa sensação de segurança? Não a sensação de segurança.
I can take risks in. Is it safe for me to interact with other people openly and truly, authentically? Is it safe for me to say what I'm really thinking? And do I trust that the people around me will be able to have uncomfortable conversations comfortably, knowing that how difficult it gets, we trust and respect each other? You can see it quite often in those conversations where someone asks your opinion, and what's going on in your head is, how honest do they really want me to be? That's a measure of psychological safety. So what does it do to us? Well, interestingly, one of the things we know about psychological safety is when we give ourselves permission to take risks, we're much more successful. We're much more successful in terms of our ambitions, but we're also much more successful in terms of the actual task. There was a study done in a number of hospitals that looked at if we create an environment of psychological safety where we make it okay for people to take risks, and we recognize that there may be mistakes within appropriate boundaries, then actually people make less mistakes. Think about that in a common sense approach. You can imagine that when you are doing a task that you've done 100 times and you do it really easily, that one time when somebody's watching you or somebody's assessing you or you feel under pressure is the time you are much more likely to make a mistake. So interestingly, by allowing people the sense that it's okay to get it wrong, they are much more likely to get it right. We also know that psychological safety doesn't just impact ourselves and our ability, it impacts us as a group, as a team. This was a study done in the workplace, looking at Google to see of all of the teams in Google, what were the most highly performing teams and what was it that made them a high performing team? Was it money? Was it resources? Was it the skill sets of the people in the team? Was it how they worked together? Was it the environment that they worked in? What we found was that the thing that mattered the most was how teams work together. The relationships between people, the agreements that they had about how they interacted, and most importantly, a sense of psychological safety. So think about your young people at the moment, whether they're about to go through exam periods, whether they're about to think about their future, or whether they're just simply going through school and managing the challenges of the current time and the challenges of every day growing up. Psychological safety becomes really important in their ability to work with other people and their ability to really truly thrive. What are the elements of psychological safety? So we can draw psychological safety from a number of places. We look how other people behave, and unfortunately for you, you are one of the most strong role models for our young people. So they look to you, and if you are demonstrating psychological safety, they are much more likely to. They look at the environment in which they're working in. Is it safe? What has happened historically? Do people interact positively or less positively with each other? We look to rhythms and ways of working, those unspoken rules. If you think about school, if you think about family, if you think about your work life, there's lots of rules and ways of doing things that nobody ever speaks about. They're not written down in any policy. We just do things. We get into rhythms and ways of doing things, and we just do them because that's how we've always done them. If those rhythms and ways of working threaten psychological safety, then it's much harder to unpick. It's not just what we do, it's how we communicate with each other that also makes a difference. Are we present? Are we communicating positively? Are we really listening to each other? And of course, wider society. No one person, no one family, no one school lives in a little bubble on its own. It's impacted by wider society. So when there's unrest and uncertainty in wider society, it absolutely impacts us on an individual level as well. So we can think about psychological safety in 4 key ways. The first is it safe to learn? That means, is it safe to admit that I don't know something? And is it safe to make mistakes within appropriate boundaries and get it wrong sometimes? The next element is it safe to challenge? Is it safe to disagree? Is it safe to offer a different opinion? Is it safe to say that the way that we're doing things isn't working for me? The third is it safe to engage and collaborate? Now, we talk about collaboration a lot. We very rarely collaborate as humans. We often cooperate. Cooperation is when we offer up information when asked. Collaboration is when we openly offer up information for no gain to myself, to make the other person better. So perhaps if you and I are working on something together, I will tell you something I know that will help you, even though I'm not going to gain anything from it and myself. And the last is it safe to be authentic? Is it safe to be who you are, what matters to you, how you naturally do things? Or are you constantly trying to fit into what you think is expected? Now, I want you to think about your psychological safety a second before we get to go on to think about the students. Let's think about how you feel. We're going to launch a poll now. Here we go. There is the first poll on the screen. Which of these do you feel? Give just your sense, a self check of how you're feeling. You can see on the screen, we've got the individual ones, safe to learn, safe to challenge, safe to be authentic, all of the above. And perhaps you feel all of those, and perhaps you feel none of those. It doesn't matter, this is completely anonymous. Nobody will see how you feel. But hopefully when Milton is ready, he will show us the results. Oh, okay, I can see the results now. So around 40% of you say that you feel safe to learn. Nobody feels safe to challenge, other than 44% of you who feel all of those things. And 9% of you feel safe to be authentic. And some of you don't feel safe in any of those areas. And the reality is that they will wax and wane. You will feel in some areas more safe than other areas. You may feel in some parts of your life safe, in other parts of your life safe, not so safe. It's very rarely a static thing. The other thing we need to understand is we don't all feel the same. So even within a family setting, you might feel very safe, somebody else might not feel quite so safe. There isn't a static level where we all feel the same. Lucia, I can see you have your hand up. Oh,
Mistakenly, sorry.
Okay, no worries at all. So then you get a sense of what it is, and it's quite different to trust. Trust is an element of psychological safety, but trust is about just me and you. How do I feel about you? How do you feel about me? Bear in mind, we build trust in about 7 seconds. Instantly within meeting with each other, we get a view of whether we trust each other, and it's very hard to move away from that initial view. But psychological safety is much bigger than that. It's a culmination of all the individual trust relationships and those other elements that we talked about as well. So we can start to think about what things show whether people have psychological safety or not, because psychological safety is a bit like Fight Club for those that have watched the full film. The first rule about psychological safety is never ask about psychological safety. Because, of course, if I don't feel safe and you ask me, I'm not going to feel safe to tell you the truth, so I'm going to tell you that I do anyway. So we have to look for it in behaviours. The first thing we can see often in ourselves, but also other people, is impression management, where we're more worried about what other people will think of us than we are fully participating. And this is very common with young people because teenage brain development, your sense of who you are and how you fit in a hierarchy amongst your peers is very, very important. So what does impression management look like? Here are a couple of ways you can see it. The first is where we don't ask questions because we're more worried that people will think we're ignorant or we weren't listening or we should know the answer. And so we're going to leave a conversation without all of the facts. I'm sure I'm not alone in not being the only one who sat in a meeting and heard people talking about things. Perhaps you've sat in a parents' meeting and you've heard people talking about things and you think, oh, I wonder about that. But rather than ask the question, your brain starts to say, probably they've said it already and I wasn't listening. Maybe I should already know. Nobody else is asking the question. So if I ask, will everyone think I'm stupid? So you leave the room without knowing the question. When actually, in reality, when somebody does ask the question, you normally see about 5 or 6 other people kind of go, oh, thankfully somebody's asked. I was thinking the same. But we see impression management in a couple of other ways as well. We don't want to admit mistakes or our weaknesses. So when we haven't done something so well, we'll cover it up or we'll try and blame something else or we'll skirt around the situation to try to not admit something, or if we can't do something, we'll say, yes, 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 of course, even though we know we can't, because we're more worried about people thinking we're incompetent than we are the damage of trying to do something that we can't. Similarly, sometimes we don't offer up ideas because we think we've asked too much already, or we've said too much, or there's somebody more important or knowledgeable in the room. Therefore, if they aren't offering up the idea, they've probably already thought about it, even though our idea could be really brilliant. And sometimes we don't criticize because we don't want to be seen as negative. And all of these things show a low psychological safety because we're more thinking about the risk than we are the reward. And they mean that we miss out and the people around us miss out on the chance to fully participate. There are some things you can do to build psychological safety, but as you can see here, some of them are much challenging in these particular times. Physical contact and physical proximity, spending time with people and actually kind of hugging people and holding people and all of those things really start to build psychological safety. And those things are hard at the moment and almost illegal at the moment, but there's lots of other things we can do that we need to be really conscious of in order to build psychological safety together. Having a shared vulnerability, getting things wrong together, not knowing things together. How often have you said to your children when they've asked you a question, I don't know the answer to that, but let's learn it together. Or we're going to try this thing together and we'll most likely be rubbish at it, but we're going to have a lot of fun learning. We need to enable short energetic exchanges. Those times when we sit our children down, and I have a teenage son, so I know how it is. Those times when we sit our children down.
Adolescente, quando nós
de horas hasta obtener lo que queremos.
Small bursts of energy and enabling young people to look away and do something else builds psychological safety, and you're much more likely to get an honest conversation. We also know that active listening, we're very poor at listening as humans. Our average listening is about 6.5 seconds, and we often do what we call automative listening. We're listening for the bits that are relevant to us, or we're listening to respond, particularly in one-on-one situations, and asking lots of open questions that don't enable a yes or no answer. Again, really start to build psychological safety. So, and you'll get these slides afterwards. Spend some time thinking about your interactions with your young people and anyone that's relevant, and think about how many of these do you do. We intend to do most of them. The reality is, in a time-poor world where we're balancing home and work and all of those other things as well, some of them we don't do as much as we'd like to. But try and intentionally do some of these things because they really help psychological safety. The other thing we can start to do is start to see the signs of how people interact together, because that will give us a sign of psychological safety. So we can see interactions that are psychologically safe or interactions that will suggest a lower psychological safety. So safe psychologically teams or groups of people will be comfortable admitting mistakes. We'll want to tell people when we've done things wrong or when we've got it wrong or when it's gone wrong, because by telling us then we're helping other people as well. When things do go wrong, which they inevitably always do, we don't look to blame other people, we look to learn. So we unpick objectively what went well, what didn't go well, recognizing that very few situations go really well or really poorly. There's always situations in the middle. And what can we do with that? What can we learn from that? What can we do better next time? So we're not feeding back, but we're feeding forward. We're thinking about that experience and how it can help us going forward, rather than how we look to justify or blame or keep talking about that backward situation. As we talked about before in the collaboration space, in psychological safety, we tend to open up to ideas. We want to share ideas, even if they're not perfect, even if we know that they won't work. We want to share what's in our brains, because then we can work on it together. And because of that situation, it means we get better decision making. People constantly question, what could we do? Why are we doing it like that? Does this still work for us? Think about your rhythms and workings of as a family. Often we know that the rhythms that you set up when your children were 5, 6, 7, you're still doing when your young people are teenagers. And actually is a good time to say, let's talk about how we do things. Is it still working? Does it work for us? How do we do things differently? What if? All of those things. In comparison, in a psychologically low safe environment, people are frightened of admitting mistakes. They try and cover them up, they try and hide them, they try and deflect blame into something else. When there is something that's gone wrong, it's where you're sat at a table and you see everybody looking to see who's going to take the blame. And we focus very much on whose fault it was rather than what we can learn. We hold on to information because information is power, and we tend not to share information until absolutely asked. And we stick in that, we've always done it like this, it's always worked, even when it's not working, which means we make lots of assumptions about situations and therefore we don't maximize our ability to make good decisions. So hopefully, again, you can see some of those in your interactions, whether it's your interactions, whether it's your young people's interactions, or whether it's you interacting as a family group. When relatedness and that sense of connection is missing, which is obviously a big issue for the moment, you start to see signs of low psychological safety at a dangerously low point. And here are some of the behaviours that you can see, and hopefully you can see these either in yourself or in young people, or perhaps in other people as well. The first thing we see is a reduction in intelligent thought and reasoning. People become very emotive. They become quite reactive to things rather than responsive to things. You then start to see an increased self-defeating behaviour. And that can look a couple of ways, depending on people's personality. It can either be that people start to procrastinate and not really get anything done. How many times have you worked with young people who are studying and they know they've got lots of exams or studying to do, but they seem to spend the whole day doing something absolutely different and wasting that time? That's what we call self-defeating behaviour. The problem feels too big, and so we try and avoid it and go and do something else, which makes the problem bigger. The other way you see this is people start to articulate self-defeat. So they'll say things like, this might be a silly idea, but, or I think this, but it's probably just me. Almost literally physically distancing themselves from the opinion to make it safer to give that opinion. We start to see impaired self-regulation. That moment of absolute explosion, absolute tears that seems out of proportion to the issue that we're dealing with, or those long emails that you get if you're at work, where they seem to have come out of nowhere and come up with 1,000 things that have never been talked at before. You see increased defensiveness. So because we're not feeling safe, we see everything as a risk, and therefore we judge everything and we believe ourselves to be judged. So perhaps even as simple as coming home and saying, oh, have you done the washing up? The other person will say, well, no, of course I haven't. I'm busy. How dare you think I haven't done that? Do you not think I haven't got enough to do? You know, rather than seeing it as a simple question, we see it as a judgment and we defend ourselves from it. And if this goes on for any length of time, we see decreased well-being, because when we feel unsafe, physically or psychologically, we start to, our sleep starts to drop off, our eating starts to drop off, cortisol, our stress hormone starts to increase. Our bodies don't know the difference between psychological safety and physical safety. So when someone doesn't feel psychologically safe, it's like they feel physically unsafe all of the time. And you can imagine what that does to your well-being. And we also start to see reduced pro-social behaviour. People literally pulling themselves away, and whilst they may still be attending things and whilst they may still be actually going to school and things, they'll be on the periphery. They'll never fully engage. So I'm going to launch a second poll here, which is around how many of these can you see and how many of these do you recognise? Oh, I think that's the second poll. We need to go on to the third one. Thank you. Oh, maybe even the next one. Those should have all come up at once, but it doesn't matter. You can vote on this one. It's absolutely fine.
There are only 3 questions, so this is the last one.
Okay, no worries. We'll just give you a couple of seconds to this one. Apologies that this one should have been attached to the first one, which is asking you to think about your psychological safety, but then asking you to think about your students and your young people's psychological safety. So as soon as we've done the voting on this, we will move forward. Whenever you've got enough votes, Milton, feel free to share.
I think people are still voting.
No worries. Now we've told you much more about it, hopefully you can really think about the answer to this and wonder actually how much different it might have been if I've asked you it right at the very start before understanding what it looks like. Okay, Milton, do you want to share the results that we've got? That would be great. Brilliant, thank you. So brilliantly, 36% of people feel like that their children feel really safe at school from a psychological point of view. Some people feel that perhaps their students don't feel any of these, and other people a real combination of those. So whichever one you chose that you think, well, maybe less of that one, think about some of the things we could do to start to build that, and we're going to unpick some of those in a minute, so don't worry. So how do we decide that sense of the periphery between, do I get involved, am I here and present but not physically, psychologically present, or am I really getting involved and am I taking risks? This is called the SCARF model. It's actually relatively new from psychological terms. It comes from a psychologist called David Rock. And it takes the same model that we know children operate from a sense of physical danger or safety, stay away from things that are hot, go towards people who are safe, like police officers, for example, depending on where you are in the world. And we've taken that to mean how much social interaction do people have? How much of themselves do they really put into interactions? And we recognize that it's based on our sense of reward and threat, or which is the highest. And you need to have 5 things to measure this. The first is status. Does your young person know the value that they bring, know that they're important, and know why they're valuable in their unique and authentic way? The second thing is certainty. Does your young person know what's going to happen? Are they in an environment where there's a level of certainty around what's going to happen and predictability and kind of structure? And the people that they interact with, they know how people are going to behave? Or are they in an environment where there's a lack of certainty? We're pretty much all in that at the moment. But equally, are they going into a room where sometimes Uncle Fabrizio is really lovely to them, and sometimes Uncle Fabrizio is really unkind to them, and they never quite know which Uncle Fabrizio they're going to get? Do they have a level of autonomy? Are they able to do things their way and in a way that works for them and bring their authentic style, or is everything very controlled for them? Do they have that sense of relatedness that we just talked about, that sense of connection? Even though we may disagree, even though we may have really tough times, do we have a sense of connection? And do they feel like things are fair? If there is a situation and they do something wrong, do they feel like they're going to be treated fairly in an equal way to other people? Or do they feel like there are some people that can do no wrong and there are some people that are always in trouble, for example? And if those 5 things are predominantly positive, then they will interact because the reward is better than the risk. If those 5 things are predominantly negative, they will always sit on the outside of something because the risk of interacting is likely to be stronger than the reward. So we can do some things as parents. We can make sure we are really explicit in the value that our young people have. Sounds really simple, but again, when we're time poor and we're under pressure and we've got lots of things to think about, we can go a long time without really being explicit, particularly when we're with teenagers who can be very challenging and we can get into the routine of only ever really talking to them when they're doing something wrong. We can make sure that all of the things that we can control, that we co-design structures and routines with them together so they know what's coming and there is a level of certainty. Of course, the external factors of COVID and other uncertainty are things that we can't control, which means it's doubly important we control that internal stuff. We can allow them a sense of autonomy, be very clear about when they are able to do things in their way, the boundaries within which they can choose, and enable them to do that. We can build that sense of connection in lots of different ways, particularly virtually at the moment. And we can just sense check ourselves that we are being fair in our interactions. So this again is something that you might want to think about going forward in terms of just measuring. When you see people on the periphery, just measure what those things and try and put those things in place. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is really focus on the input of what a young person is doing, not just the outcome. Because the more we focus on, did you come top at your exam? What grade did you get? And not, did you try your best? Did you really put the effort in? The more we focus on just the outcome, it makes it much harder to risk. And we're only going to interact when we're really sure we're going to do well, because children are predominantly pleasers. They want to please you. We need to make sure that when we're doing activities or events like exams and things, we give them perspective. It's very easy for us as adults to say, that exam is the most important thing in the world. And if you don't do well at this exam, your whole life is going to be damaged, because we want them to do well. But sometimes when we add that pressure, the chances are they're going to do even less well. Remember what we said about the start, about the more we give them opportunities to make mistakes within appropriate boundaries, the less likely they are to make mistakes. We can recognize that anything is uncertain, so there is always potential for error. So don't set such rigid rules that actually they don't have the bandwidth to work within those rules, and recognize that there might be times that things happen out of their control.
O jovem não consegue trabalhar, e sempre se assegurando de que você esteja presente, porque
no podemos dejar de hacer todo lo que tenemos que hacer, entonces tenemos que asegurarnos que estamos dividiendo el tiempo para realmente dedicarnos a ellos cuando, por ejemplo, conversamos con ellos, ¿no? Y evitar dividirnos haciendo otras cosas que siempre pensamos que no hacemos, pero que hacemos. No, hay que tener esa escucha activa. Y hay que ver también el comportamiento para saber cómo se sienten los jóvenes con los que usted interactúa.
Sentem seguros ou não. A falibilidade e a humildade pode ser algo que nós
open it up with, I might be wrong. I've probably missed something. Can you help me make this a really good decision? So you're allowing them in. Admit your own mistakes and publicly, whether they're past mistakes, things that you didn't do so well, or whether they're things that you've tried to do now and you're not getting right. If you can admit them, it makes it much easier for young people to do the same too. And importantly, when they are challenging us and when they're having uncomfortable conversations, recognize the confidence and courage that that takes. And even if it's an uncomfortable conversation, and even if you disagree, embrace the fact that the young person is willing to have the difficult conversation and see that conflict as an opportunity to learn together and build safety together. And that means when they have a view that's very different to ours, we need to approach that with curiosity and not judgment. Because if we dismiss their view and tell them they're wrong and not going to talk about it anymore, we've told them that it's not safe to engage, and the next time they simply won't engage. But it isn't just about you, it's about what you do. Remember the rhythms and ways of work that we talked about? So we can make sure we're all approaching everything with curiosity and not criticism. The world is a complex, changing, messy place at the moment. So we can make sure we're really coming at things with an open mind. When we've done something wrong, we can state it and we can say why and we can move on. And if we're encouraging everyone in our family, everyone in our young person's life to do that, it becomes much easier to do. And when we do that, then let's make sure we focus on what would have been better next time rather than what went wrong. And we can also make sure we're asking for feedback, whether it's in a family unit, whether it's in a peer friendship unit, whether it's in a school young person unit. Make sure we're creating informal feedback. We're giving each other feedback all of the time, and that we're receiving that feedback with the positive intention of uncomfortable conversations to help us all be better. Way of helping give feedback, because it can become very difficult, is this simple model. When you were X, Y, or Z, giving the young person a sense of grounding of the conversation that you're talking about, you did this. So you're not making a piece of feedback generic to a person. How many times do we say as parents, you are so untidy, you are this? We're making about them as a person, as opposed to, when I asked you to tidy your room and you sat on your PlayStation instead, so I'm very clearly giving them the when, and I'm very clear in giving them the action, not the person, I felt it was disrespectful. So I'm not saying it was disrespectful, because then we're just going to get into an argument about what's disrespectful and what isn't. But I'm owning the feeling, and I'm encouraging that connection on a personal level. And therefore, I'd love it that next time you'd either tell me you were going to play on the PlayStation, do it later, or you just do it when I asked you to. So again, I'm being very clear about what I want someone to do. And if we can practice that and encourage young people to give us feedback in the same way, it really, really boosts psychological safety. We can also think about what underpins this, the must-haves. We need to have 4 things in our lives to really have strong well-being. And at times like this, strong well-being is really important. We need to have positive relationships, that connection that we talked about. We need to be able to align what we're doing on a daily basis with something that really matters to us, a sense of purpose. And that means we have to understand our young people enough to understand what really matters to them. Rightly or wrongly, sometimes exams and school doesn't matter to young people. So we have to find the hook that means it aligns to their sense of purpose. We need to have a level of autonomy. We've talked about that. And we need to have a sense of progress. No matter how much further we've got to go, we need to be able to look back and see that we have made some progress, even if it's not a lot in comparison to how much further we've gone. So do you really talk about how much further, now you've got to do this, now you've got this, now you've got this? Or do you take the time to celebrate the little steps of progress, even if it's a long way away from the finish? I just want to talk a little bit about the current climate before I open up for questions. In the current situation, whether it's COVID, whether it's societal uncertainty, there's lots of challenges to psychological safety. So we have to be really intentional in our behaviour. There's the physical distance. We're hardwired to connect physically with each other, and therefore the physical distance of not being able to see people can be really challenging. That brings the affinity distance, that sense of connection, that sense of knowing how people are. Think about those 5 elements of the scarf that we talked about. They're all challenged when we're in particularly this difficult COVID time. And lots of things can feel out of control and decisions are being taken away from us. And when we feel like decisions are being taken away from us, it's very hard to maintain our psychological safety because, of course, we have no say in what's going to happen. So here are some things you can really help in this situation. I've called it remote working. I mean remote working, not in the workplace, but in terms of working either remotely with school and home, or, you know, not spending time with different people, that kind of remoteness. So you can ensure you've got clear communication channels. Young people know how to communicate with you, when to communicate with you, you know, what methods they're going to get the best results. We can encourage participation and active listening. So really make sure that when you can spend time together in whatever group that is, it's good time and everyone's participating. You're not all sat in different rooms doing different things. You can make sure that you're responding positively to suggestions, questions, and fears. Sometimes if we don't feel the same, we can dismiss how people feel, and that can be really damaging to psychological safety. So always work with something to get to the outcome that you want. When people are telling us they're not feeling great or they're struggling, we need to make sure that we're focusing on the positives, but we're avoiding toxic positivity. What that means is, if somebody says, I hate being remote, I need to see my friends, I hate this situation, we can say, but think of the other things that you can do. At least you can, you know, but we're not falling into dismissing what they're saying. This is a bit like the, you know, I feel really ill today. Oh, there's always people worse off than you. What that does is called toxic positivity. It's unrealistic because those other people, you can't connect to them, so it doesn't matter. But also it dismisses how that person's feeling. It's almost saying you don't have the right to feel how you can, and that can really damage a person's well-being. This is a great opportunity in uncertainty to develop resilience and develop growth mindset, and not focus on the outcomes that are out of our control, but really focus on the input, and make sure we're building human-to-human connection wherever we possibly can. I've given you some top tips, but I want you to focus on the picture on the side. Psychological safety doesn't happen by accident. We have to be intentional. We are not hardwired to be intentional in our relationship building. So it only happens when we're intentional in our action. So make sure that you're really inputting those small nudges into place, and make sure that you're intentional in your action, because if we're not creating ways of working intentionally, we're creating other ways of working unintentionally, and they are much, much harder to unpick. So I've given you lots to think about, but I wanted to leave lots of time for questions. So Lucia, feel free to ask the question.
Yes, wow, thank you, Claire. That was really very, very interesting, and so many tips and so many things. Well, we've got a number of questions. Andres Cuñaro asked a question, and he said about how can you improve an environment that has many things that make you feel not safe psychologically, but then he said you've already given us so many tips, so that's already answered. Juan Pablo Apestegui comments that I assume they as a family work a lot in the concept of responsibility versus the concept of guilt. How do you consider this? Is it positive or negative? And he says he sees his son has acquired this and is now noticing that society talks a lot about guilt, and he thinks it's not right. So what can you say about that?
Absolutely true. We have got what we call at the moment a casting stones generation, where because of social media mostly, but also because of how society is changing, lots of people feel that their job is to tell everybody else what they're doing wrong, but not reflect back on their own actions. So responsibility is really important, but also recognizing where responsibility isn't as well. So a great thing to do with young people is say, in a situation, what was in your control, what was out of your control, and focus on those things that were in their control. And in terms of psychological safety doesn't mean there's no consequences. It means that the consequences are about learning for the future. So make sure when somebody has done something wrong, there will always be a punitive element, but make sure the focus is on this is the punishment in order to help you be better next time, rather than the punishment. Because we hold on to bad feelings about 8 times longer than we do good feelings. So if you punish a young person and it's a negative experience, not only will they don't have consequential thinking. So there isn't a level of thinking of, if I do this again, that will happen again. Their brains are not developed in that way until about 17 or 18. So that isn't going to work. Instead, try and make sure that the punishment is about learning and doing different next time, rather than a punitive element, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you. Somebody asked, what do we do if we realize that we have a child doesn't have psychological safety, but refuses to get help?
So I would say, first of all, think about the things that you can do around that child that builds psychological safety. Those structures, that sense, the scarf model that we talked about. Also, start to try and understand what's going on. So talk to the young person about, what do you think might go wrong in this situation? Why are you worried? Don't say there's no reason to be worried, because our own reality is our reality. Talk to them about what might happen. And if that happens, what are you going to do about it? Because often we fear the fear much more than we fear the reality. So enabling a young person to say, if I go into that class with a new group of people and nobody likes me, it will be okay for the first day, because the next day I might do something that will help me build friendships. When they feel equipped, when they feel I have a toolbox of what to do, it can really build their psychological safety. The third thing is, of course, if you're really worried for your child from a well-being point of view, always seek professional help, whether that's through school, whether it's through your doctor, whether it's through another means. Always seek professional help, because early intervention in well-being is much more effective than later intervention.
And there's a lot at stake. Laura from Uruguay says that this presentation helped her think, as her own educational and work history was affected by traumas from her childhood, and how this generated didn't generate psychological safety. But she says, and this is what I wanted to point out for you, Claire, it helped me rethink my relationship with my 12-year-old son. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome.
That was a nice comment. Many people are asking, we're going to share this, we're going to share the recording, and we are going to be sharing the slides as well, so that you can listen to it again, as a few people had said. Somebody asked, what about lack of motivation? What can we do about that?
So motivation is really interesting, because often there's very few people that lack motivation, truly lack motivation. What they have is more limiting beliefs than drivers. So we need to do a couple of things. We need to help them develop their drivers, and that's what that is intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation, doing something because somebody else wants you to, or there's a punishment if you don't do it, is very short-lived, and actually can damage intrinsic motivation, because teenagers particularly, they want to push against the system. So the more you tell them to do something, the less likely they are to do it, even if secretly they want to. I think most of us can remember that feeling. So we need to build intrinsic motivation through nudges, through encouragement, through rewarding the right behavior rather than challenging the wrong behavior, because that's where your motivation stays. The other thing to the self-limiting beliefs is help the young person talk about why they're frightened of doing something, or what they think to be true. Helping a young person write what we call their script. This is who I am, this is where I fit, this is really good. And it can, if they feel comfortable sharing with you can tell them a lot about how they're feeling. Also get them to look at what we call derailers and radiators. So derailers are things that help us lose confidence, take us off track, take away our energy. And what radiators are things that give us energy, give us confidence. So simply get them to write a list of the things that give them confidence and the things that take away confidence. And then when you're in a situation, get them to think about how do you make those things that give you confidence in that situation, because often they're things that other people do, or how do you take out those things that take away. The last thing I'd say about that is when young people have exams or real stressful times, the first thing that goes for them are the things that give them energy and confidence. So seeing their friends, playing sport, we often say, no, you're revising, you've got to sit there all day. Actually, that half hour of doing something else will boost their productivity in the other space. So give them permission to do the things that keep them on track, because it will keep the bigger space for them to actually use that time productively.
The amount of questions, Claire, is incredible. So I'm trying to pick and choose the ones that seem more sort of similar.
If we don't get through them, I'm really happy to take them off and write answers as well.
Okay, well, that's lovely, because we've also got a few questions in the chat box. Maggie Casares asks, as from what age can we start talking about psychological safety? Are there any special tips for younger children?
So absolutely start talking about it at any age. In child development, we tend to talk about 8. Age 8 is where a lot of our sense of values is built, and you'll know that from school. We tend to say 8 is too late. So anything below 8 is a good time to have these conversations. And of course, you need to make it age appropriate. So you can talk about what makes you feel happy, what makes you feel like you belong, what makes you feel brave, as opposed to, you know, have you got a sense of connection? So you can change the language, but the things that you do around young people, you should try to build in as soon as possible and then evolve them. The older a child gets, the more you should co-design things. Because if you co-design things, they feel like they've had an input and they're much more likely to therefore kind of stick with it.
Yes. What happens when in a family, the son who has low psychological safety feeling always gets critiqued by, or yes, criticized by the elder brother or sister and the younger. So he's in the middle and always gets this from his siblings, and he's already not very secure psychologically. What can they do as a family?
And that's a really common experience. The first thing you can do is maybe talk to the other young people and say, you know, how would you feel if the only thing you ever heard from other people was something you were doing wrong or not doing well enough, or, you know, and get them to see, because often that critique isn't intentional. It's just the thing that we get into doing. So try and speak to the other young people and help them balance that out. You can put in structures. So I know I've worked with people before who put in time for, I'd like people to do things differently, but then absolutely time for sharing what they love about each other and what they like with each other. Commonly stop, start, continue is a great way of doing that. But make sure the whole family are doing it. So, you know, I love it when you do that. You know, I'd love you to continue that. I'd love you to start doing this, and I'd love you to think about stopping doing this. And if you make that a regular feedback in your family, that's really important. The other thing is, make sure that that young person is getting positives from other places as well. You know, you can't, as a parent, you can't control everything. And siblings are unkind to each other at the best of times. So make sure that you're really inputting that space with that young person to hear the positives as well.
Right, there is one here that they say, Leandro says that his daughter is going through a very bad time, product of this uncertainty we're all living in. She's very demanding on herself with the studies, and she hasn't been able to adapt to online work. This sort of generates like a vicious circle where she can't concentrate, and therefore she can't do her homework well enough, and so she's not acting at the level or producing at the level she'd like to. So she's now having issues with sleep and eating disorder and eating. So they're not finding a way out of this sort of vicious circle. And is there any tip that you could give them?
The first is recognize you're doing your best. These are really difficult times. There are a couple of things you can try. One is sit with your daughter and help her to reframe some of her expectations. So it's less about I must be top of the class or I must be X, and it's more about input. And sometimes by taking away that I must be to I'm going to do my best, it can take the pressure off. The second thing is try and enable her to structure her time so that she's building in good sleep time, good eat time, exercise, you know, as well as study, and help her understand. There's lots of research out there that tells you that, you know, those things are the drivers to high performance. So kind of help her see those and build those things in. And I think the third thing is try and help her to recognize the things she can control and focus on those. So there's quite a nice graph, and I'll send it and you can send it on with things that you can directly control, things that you can indirectly control, things that are outside of your control, and get her to work on where am I spending my time? Because if you're spending time worrying about things you can't control, then that's a stressor that you could do away with. And therefore focusing in on those little goals every day can really help. The other thing I would say is, and again, I'll send this so you've got it. We have lots of chemicals in our brain. And when we feel uncertain, and when certainly when we're not outside and our patterns have changed, those chemicals can be impacted. And we talk a lot about physical health and maintaining healthy eating, but we need to do the same for our brain as well. And there's a list of things we can really do that keep the brain healthy as well as the body from an eating and routines point of view. So just try and put some of those in as well.
That would be lovely. There is an enormous amount of questions, and I wish we had another hour with you just for questions. But it's very generous of you that you said that you can pick them up. So I'm sure that Milton can help us not lose them when the session finishes, so that you can pick them up for us, Milton, from the chat box and from the Q&A. We'll share them with Claire, and once Claire has put some, maybe we'll group them a bit for you so we don't send you so many. And then when you send us the answer, we will share with all of you who've attended today. Somebody mentioned also, is there any books that you could recommend? So if you could add that in your feedback or in what you're going to be sending us. I cannot thank you enough. We've had almost 300 people, I think, at one point. Some people said they had to leave, and all we're getting is thank you, thank you, thank you. Very interesting. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And it has been amazing. I've made my notes. I always write things, and I don't have a teenage kid anymore. But I loved one thing. It was embrace the messenger. I love many things. I love the scarf. I love the active listening, and not listening to answer, but to understand, asking questions, giving them the space to co-create with you. And the embrace the messenger, I think, embraces the whole heart of your message today, of the content of your conversation today. So thank you so much.
You're really welcome.
I look forward to seeing you again this week for teachers, and we'll continue working on these questions together. Okay.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
so much,
Have
Claire.
a great day.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. I hope you have a lovely rest of the morning, rest of the afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much, everybody. Ask Cambridge International, we are delighted to have been allowed into your homes and take such positive tips to follow in this new stage of life that we're all going through. Thank you so much. Stay safe, everyone.